George Washington professor Marcy Norton, where did Snickers bars and Marlboros come from?
Well, we have to go way back in time. Tobacco and chocolate are both native to the Americas and were developed by Indians. Tobacco in the distant past, several thousand years BCE, and cacao, which is the raw central ingredient to chocolate, likewise, maybe around 3000 BCE. And so they were central to Native Americans. And when Europeans had no knowledge of them until they arrived, starting with Columbus in 1492, and went from there.
How were they used in these ancient cultures here?
So tobacco was used in a whole multitude of ways. Smoked, cigars, pipes, sort of cigarette-like substances, also used topically as medicines, snuff through the nose, enemas, a whole host of applications, sort of varying depending on the region. Chocolate had a more restricted domain, but what's really important to remember is that it was a beverage, almost exclusively, not just in the Americas, but in Europe until the 18th or 19th century. So it was a stimulant beverage used in some ways the way that we think of coffee today. And I could go on about it.
Please do.
So chocolate had a more restricted domain in the Americas than tobacco. It was used by groups we know today as Aztec and Maya and other groups in the broader region that we call Mesoamerica. And it was many different concoctions, but one of the favorite ones had cacao, the central ingredient, mixed with water, and then a whole host of spices, chili peppers that gave it a kind of spicy bite, and annatto or achiote, which made it red, and the redness was really actually very central to the experience because it reminded people of blood. And then floral flavorings such as vanilla and two other common ones that we don't use anymore that were restricted to the Americas for the most part, but that gave it kind of a cinnamony, clovey kind of experience. And in consuming chocolate, for instance, it was really a whole sensory experience. So it wasn't just about the taste, but it was also about the texture. There was a foam on top that was really important to Mesoamericans as they consumed it. Special drinking vessels made out of ceramics or gourds that were lacquered. So important that these vessels were actually part of the tribute that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma had from his subject peoples. So that was sort of the physical composition, but it was also incredibly important culturally. So chocolate was seen as one of the perks of the elite. It was a kind of conspicuous status consumption to drink fine chocolate. And it was really important in rites of sociability. So you couldn't have a meeting of diplomats or traders without chocolate, and it was often used in a very ceremonial ritual before any kind of feasting would begin. And among Aztec cultures, there would be a ceremonial use of chocolate and tobacco together, and bouquets of flowers you hear described, and served in this very choreographed manner. And one of the arguments of my book is that when the Europeans arrived, they actually adopted the customs almost, there were some differences, but there was an essential continuity. Like Mesoamericans, Europeans began to associate them as quintessential symbols of sociability and also of status in the case of chocolate. Tobacco had sort of more different uses among different social levels. And even, for instance, today we have Valentine's Day association with chocolate as being kind of erotic. And that, too, was something that Europeans learned from Mesoamericans as well.
So, Marcy Norton, in 1492, Columbus discovers the Americas. Does he bring back cacao and tobacco on that first voyage?
Well, certainly not cacao or chocolate, because the area that he arrived in the Caribbean, chocolate wasn't used. So he actually did run across cacao on his fourth voyage in 1504 when he was off the coast of Honduras. There's no evidence that he actually saw chocolate itself, but he saw the cacao beans, and he noted how valued they were to the traders, that it was described by his son as if they were like eyeballs when they fell down. But tobacco, he came across, it seems, almost immediately because it was so central in the Caribbean, and in fact was even offered tobacco leaves as a gift, which would have been a sort of traditional diplomatic a gesture among those groups. He sent out men to go investigate the inland of what's today Haiti and Dominican Republic, and there they describe people smoking it. So that's our first record of Europeans seeing it. There's no evidence that he himself tried tobacco, but pretty soon afterwards, if not, and it's not unlikely that some of his men might have, and the reason that it's not unlikely is because it was so central to sociability that when the explorers were going out, and sometimes we have this image of Europeans just coming and sort of invading, which it's not totally untrue, but they were actually really dependent on native groups for information, for food, for diplomatic and military alliances. And so as with any arriving person or envoy who wants to get something from another group, you kind of have to make yourself conform to what their customs are when you're in a vulnerable position as they were. And so it's sort of when in Rome, do as the Romans do, when in the Caribbean, do as the Caribbeans do. And that involved accepting tobacco. And when Europeans arrived into Mesoamerica, into what we now know as Mexico, or they called New Spain, the same thing with chocolate, since chocolate was also part of the sociability rituals of those groups. But there's kind of a split reaction. I'm making it sound like they were immediately very welcoming to that. And that wasn't the case. On the one hand, they sort of were exposed to it and began to consume it in those situations, but they also were very suspicious of it as well. Tobacco for Europe, the smoking of something for them was sort of reminiscent of things that they thought about as witchcraft. And they also clued on pretty soon that tobacco and chocolate were not only important in rituals of sociability, but were also part of native religion. And part of the mission of these Europeans was to bring their religion to it. And so it was very disconcerting to look at these substances, and so they described it as kind of idolatry and demonic diabolism and so forth. So you have this kind of like almost schizophrenic reaction, whereas on the one hand, on the frontier, they're using it. On the other hand, the early chroniclers are describing tobacco in particular as emblematic of the idolatry of the Native Americans. And this actually creates a kind of problem for Europeans several decades down the line, or more like a century down the line, when tobacco starts being used in Europe and they become curious about its origins. They have this kind of print record of describing tobacco as kind of the ultimate idolatry and kind of barbarian behavior. And so they're faced with reconciling their own new habits with the way that they described it earlier on.
Well, when did tobacco catch on in Europe and elsewhere?
There's actually a significant time lag. Part of the research that I did for this project, which really hadn't been done before, was to kind of systematically look in trade records and see when you start seeing them in a systematic way. So we have evidence that there's kind of erratic and idiosyncratic imports of both of the goods throughout the 16th century, throughout the 1500s. As you would expect, as some Europeans start to get habituated to it in the Americas, they need their stash when they go back. Particularly sailors were associated with tobacco early on, and a few returning conquistadors. But you don't see them at all in the trade records until the 1590s. And that's when you have a sort of critical mass of consumers, a kind of, we'd say in contemporary language, maybe first adopters. And I identified sort of three vanguard groups as these kind of early users. You wouldn't be surprised that colonial sort of officials, elite aristocrats returning, merchants who are involved, and then a third group, which might be surprising for our contemporary sensibilities, are actually clergy. who were a significant group who kind of would go back and forth. So clergy in particular, early